Good afternoon. You're about to be subjected to an extended period of autobiographical self-indulgence, which I hope will hold some interest, maybe even some value, especially for those early in their career journey. Like many in this room, I became addicted to programming at a young age and devoured any programming reading material I could find. Eventually, I encountered an article in the March 1983 issue of Byte magazine titled Simulating Reality with Computer Graphics. It showed me that you could use computers and math to make amazing images. There were spaceships, planets, shiny glass spheres, shiny chrome blobs, jumping skeletons, cars which were also shiny. Everything was shiny. Maybe not the skeletons. It was the usual early CG fare, but to me it was a revelation. It's hard to verbally describe the effect that article had on my 15-year-old mind, so I'll try using a 1980s appropriate visualization. Yes, that it was quite impactful. After that, I had my heart set on programming graphics for a living, and some of my other reading material gave that dream a more specific shape. Israel's home computer scene in the 80s followed the UK rather than the USA, likely due to geographical proximity. So UK video game magazines formed another large part of my reading diet. Those magazines were full of stories about teenage bedroom coders who wrote a game by themselves or with a few friends on a home microcomputer and turned it into an exciting and even lucrative career in game development. I found that highly aspirational and I wanted to pursue that dream. Initially, I told my parents I was skipping college and just focusing on that. But my parents convinced me to give it a trial run first. By then, I had my own computer, a Commodore 64, but no development tools of any sort, except for a Hexmon cartridge that I wheedled out of my baffled grandparents for my birthday. So I made a game the hard way, handwritten assembly, and manually converting sprites from paper grid to byte values. It was a lot of hard work and much of it was tedious, but I really, really wanted to be a game programmer. The result was technically competent, but let's say somewhat lacking in novelty and compelling gameplay. The only taker I found for it was a local game store. They were willing to buy 50 copies, but only if I recorded the cassettes myself at home. At the time, I took this as a pretty definitive failure. I tried the bedroom coder path, and it really hadn't worked. So I did what seemed like the practical thing. I buried the game development dream in the backyard, and I went to the Technion to study computer engineering. After university, my first job was in the CPU design department at Intel Haifa. My job title was lead architect for the P55C processor. That sounds amazingly grand for a new graduate, but it was a lot less impressive than it sounded. For one thing, I was also the only architect for the P55C processor. Secondly, being an architect in practice actually involved running benchmark simulations of various CPU design variations for the benefit of the group that really designed the chip, the microarchitects. The microarchitects were the people who created the processor logic in VHDL, which was then compiled down to circuitry and finally to silicon layer geometry. But I guess lead architect sounds better than simulation monkey. The P55C project went through some travails that ended up changing my path. I joined Intel in 1993, when the original Pentium, the P5, had just released. The Santa Clara design team was hard at work on a successor, the P54C, which was a straight process shrink of the P5. A process shrink is what you do when you move an existing chip design onto a new process. The P54C was initially having trouble reaching its maximum operating frequency of 100 megahertz, and that implied extremely poor yields for that version of the chip. 100 megahertz was a very important magic number for product marketing, and this was expected to be the flagship version of the chip. It really needed to have good yields, and that was the original motivation of the P55C product. Intel tasked the Haifa design team with tweaking the microarchitecture to eliminate the frequency bottlenecks and reach the magic 100 megahertz number. However, during P55C development, the first P54C silicon samples hit, and Intel's fab engineers started to do their semiconductor process wizardry, tuning implant doses, anneal temperatures, oxide thicknesses, and other analog stuff that to us digital folk resembled nothing so much as a witch tinkering with her brew of potions. A lot of this work was product-specific tuning for the P54C and pushed its frequency distribution upwards to the point that P55C's microarchitecture advantages became moot. It was getting clear that the P55C project no longer had a compelling reason to exist, and it would very likely be cancelled. The Haifa team was used to project cancellations. It had happened to them a lot, and they had adopted a somewhat fatalistic attitude about this, as can be seen by these sweatshirts that were handed out after one especially promising project was canceled. We were getting ready to have the Dragon chomp down on the P55C as well, when Haifa management decided to adopt a more proactive approach. Alex Pellig, my boss at the time, had been running MMX as a side skunkworks project since 1992. The idea behind MMX was to add SIMD, single instruction, multiple data instructions, to the Intel instruction set, often called the x86 instruction set after the model numbers of the first CPUs in the series. Adding SIMD instructions to a general purpose CPU was a pretty pioneering idea at the time. The first entries in this category from HP Sun and MIPS hadn't come out yet, and none of them were mass market processors. It was also controversial. At the time, Intel upper management viewed the x86 instruction set as Intel's crown jewels and the source of its competitive moat. This was still several years before AMD started rolling out their own designs. MMX stayed in limbo until the desire to give the P55C new life spurred Intel Haifa to put new energy into pitching it, with P55C as the launch vehicle. The effort succeeded, giving the P55C a new product identity. Now it was the Pentium processor with MMX technology. P55C's pivot to MMX had an unexpected result for me personally. Today, Intel's developer outreach is a massive global operation, but before MMX, it was very much in its infancy. MMX required explicit low-level code changes, and specialized knowledge was needed to use it effectively. Intel suddenly found itself needing to spin up a major developer outreach effort very quickly. I was pulled into emergency service supporting developers in Europe and Asia, many of whom were game developers. MX involved careful manual instruction scheduling. This was before out-of-order processors and vectorizing SIMD compilers, and I found I was pretty good at that sort of thing. My intimate knowledge of the CPU internals certainly helped. The opportunity to do low-level optimization coding and collaborate with game developers rekindled my old dream of becoming a game developer, which I had thought safely buried. It also gave me relevant skill, which would give me at least a fighting chance of getting a job in the game industry. I talked to my wife and we decided to take the plunge, though it would be a scary step. I'd be changing almost everything about my professional life. And since we'd need to leave Israel, which didn't have much of a game industry at the time, my and my wife's personal life as well. At the time, game companies were notoriously reluctant to hire people without prior game development experience. I had to make myself into the most appealing candidate I could to compensate for that. First, I had to make sure my knowledge and skills were solid. I knew a fair bit about low-level x86 optimization, especially with respect to MMX, but I knew I had gaps. I filled those in by reading Michael Abrash's Ramblings in Real-Time column in Dr. Dobbs' journal. I also needed more graphics-specific programming knowledge, ideally demonstrated with a sample program. Chris Hecker had a series of Game Developer magazine articles about designing an efficient software rasterizer. I read through all of those. I applied all of this, plus my MMX knowledge, to write an MMX-optimized software rasterizer, and I made a 3D real-time rendering demo. Again, I didn't have any content authoring tools, so the best I could do was a rotating human torso, modeled with mesh data that I had to type into a text file manually. And it was textured with a cropped image from a fantasy painting. I was definitely getting flashbacks to the hand-drawn sprites from my teenage game attempt. The major countries for game development at the time were the USA, the UK, and Japan. It made sense to focus only on the USA since I was a citizen there. I carefully wrote a targeted CV which emphasized my relevant experience and skills, and sent it with a demo to every single US video game company I could get the contact details for, which was 30 different companies. I expected great success. What I got was 2 interviews and 1 job offer. Fortunately, the one offer was with Westwood Studios, developer of the Command and Conquer series, which I was a great fan of. My wife and I immediately packed and moved to sunny Las Vegas, Nevada, where Westwood Studios, despite its name, was located. This seems like a success story. I gave it my dream and I took the safe path, but eventually a route opened back up to the dream and it all worked out. But looking back, I realized it is actually a cautionary tale. Teenage me drew the wrong lesson from that first failure. The game was not good enough to launch a career, sure, but that didn't mean the dream was wrong. It just meant I wasn't ready yet. What I actually did was bury the dream and choose the safe path, and the safe path happened to work out surprisingly well, but just out of sheer luck. MX happened, Intel needed developer outreach, I got to work with game developers, I acquired low-level optimization skills that would help me get into games. Very easily, those things might not have happened. Maybe I never get pulled into MMX software work. Maybe I stay on the CPU architecture path and have a perfectly respectable career while occasionally having wistful dreams about what would have happened if I kept trying to make games. On the other hand, I think I could have made a better choice. I was correct to decide not to skip college and not to rely on game development for my immediate livelihood. But dropping the dream was a mistake. If I were advising my younger self, I would say, choose a safe path in a way that keeps the dream alive. Study software instead of hardware engineering. Take every graphics adjacent elective. Work on hobby graphics projects. Look for game adjacent jobs, media, graphics drivers, simulation, anything that builds relevant skill and evidence. If I had done that, I would likely have gotten into games with a better head start. Which brings me to the first lesson of this talk. A setback should change your route, but it should not make you abandon your destination. So that is how I got into Westwood Studios. The role I was assigned was graphics lead on a new project, a space MMORPG, massively multiplayer online role-playing game, set in outer space called Earth and Beyond. My first challenge was the planet terrain lighting system, which was very slow and needed to be sped up significantly. Since this was my first major game graphics task, it was very important to me to make a good impression. I decided Earth and Beyond was going to have the best damn terrain lighting system ever made, both in terms of speed and quality. I started by taking a close look at requirements and constraints. I wanted to account for all elements of outdoor terrain lighting: direct sunlight with shadowing, ideally soft shadowing, direct skylight with occlusion, and if possible, even indirect bounce. And it needed to run on the CPU with very low computation and storage requirements. The second step was grabbing all the reading material I could find on the subject to make sure I really understood the theory top to bottom. The first things I read and learned would be considered extremely remedial today. Basic principles of rendering theory, like the definitions of radiance and irradiance, simple lighting integrals, etc. You may wonder why someone hired as the rendering lead on a big budget game wouldn't know these things already. After all, today a game rendering engineer would get kicked out of the interview loop if they couldn't recite the rendering equation in their sleep. The fact was that in the 1990s, most game graphics engineers didn't know this stuff because there wasn't much need for them to. We had only just left the era of 2D sprites. Simply rendering a textured mesh with perfect lighting required massive effort, either by writing highly optimized textured rasterizers on the CPU, or by wrangling the first generation of graphics accelerators or console 3D hardware, which were extremely limited, often not widely available, and difficult to access. OpenGL was something people used on $20,000 workstations, and Direct3D was in its infancy and quite unreliable. The desired skills were around navigating those challenges, not rendering theory. Another thing I learned about, which seems extremely basic today, is normal mapping. Again, this is something taught in the first few days of the most rudimentary intro graphics course, but it was not widely known in the game industry in the 1990s. We were still some years away from being able to practically do normal mapping in games. Doom 3 was the first game to use it extensively, as opposed to a few special cases here and there, and it came out in 2004. Once I got past stuff that would be taught on the first day of a computer graphics 101 course nowadays, I moved on to the deeper topics, going over any published rendering techniques that could be useful. For the sun shadowing, I chose horizon mapping, introduced by Nelson Max in 1988. The idea is to pre-compute horizon angles in various directions around each texel and store them in a horizon map. These can then be compared to the light's elevation angle to determine shadowing. In my case, I only did 2 horizon angles since the sun moved in a fixed plane. The technique also supports soft shadowing if we define an angular extent of the light. That took care of sunlight. Between horizon mapping and normal mapping, I could compute it very cheaply. That left skylight and indirect bounce. I didn't find any approaches that would work reasonably for sunlight, indirect bounce, so I abandoned that stretch goal, leaving skylight and direct only. I realized that all aspects of skylight, direct contribution, occlusion, and indirect bounce could in principle be pre-computed exactly for a constant color sky. Just compute lighting for a 1 intensity white sky, color 111, store the result, and at runtime multiply that by the current sky color. For my purposes, approximating the sky as a single color would be good enough. But if the game team wanted better directional variation in the future, we could extend the technique by dividing the sky into a small number of patches. The problem is that to actually execute on this idea, I would need to implement a full radiosity solver. Otherwise, I found a nice theoretical idea, but not a usable solution. John Carmack implemented the initial radiosity solver for Quake 2 in about a week. But I would be the first to admit, I am no John Carmack. And I didn't have the time for a much lengthier development task. The terrain lighting system was just one of many rendering problems that had to be solved to ship Earth and Beyond. So I needed a shortcut that would give me an approximate result with less time investment. Fortunately, I ran into just such a shortcut when trying to solve a different problem, computing the horizon angles efficiently. The brute force tool I wrote was slow enough to make even experimentation difficult, and would definitely not be suitable as a production tool. I found this paper which did include a method for quickly computing horizon angles on a height field, but it turned out to have some unexpected gems buried way in the back. I tend to read papers all the way through, which can be pretty inefficient if you're going over a lot of them. But in this case, I struck gold in the experimental results section. The author was talking about the rendering system used to display his results, and I saw this sentence: to avoid expensive radiosity computation, we will use an illumination model developed by Stewart and Langer. Cha-ching! Apparently the author was a lazy bastard just like me, and was just trying to get out of the work of writing a radiosity solver. I looked up that illumination model. It was from an older paper by the same author with a collaborator, and it was a computer vision paper, not a graphics paper. The Stewart and Langer illumination model actually proved to be useful multiple times throughout my career, most often in the context of ambient occlusion. It's an elegant, simple idea which is not well known in the graphics community, so I'll cover it here. Forgive me for speaking about rendering at I3D. First, I'll describe the problem it solves. The issue with indirect lighting is that it is inherently recursive. Let's look at a relatively simple case. A Lambertian scene under uniform external illumination. A terrain on an overcast day is fairly close to that. For a non-emissive Lambertian surface, the rendering equation is quite simple. Albedo over pi times the cosine weighted integral of incoming radiance over the hemisphere around the surface normal. In the case of uniform external illumination, like a constant colored sky, this can be split over two integrals. The set of directions that have visibility to the sky and the set of directions that don't. Since the sky radiance is constant, we can take it out of the integral, and then we're left with just cosine weighted visibility. Now, as many of you know, cosine weighted visibility over pi is simply ambient occlusion. The term on the left is basically the ambient occlusion approximation of uniform lighting, which ignores bounce light. The term on the right is where the difficulty comes in, because the input light from an occluded direction is the outgoing light from a different point. And of course, to compute that, you have to run another full integral and so forth. In theory, this never converges, but in practice, there are, of course, methods to find a solution. But now you're talking about algorithms like radiosity or Monte Carlo path tracing. This is difficult enough to implement for rendering. It is much more difficult for computer vision because you have to solve for the input scene that yields a given image. The recursive nature of global illumination makes that very difficult, especially given the state of machine learning in the 1990s. Stewart and Langer cut the recursive loop short by noting that for the case of uniform lighting in a constant albedo scene, points tend to see other points with the same outgoing radiance. They suggest an approximation based on the assumption that the output radiance from visible points is the same as for the current point. They found that this approximation only introduces a relatively small amount of error, and it simplifies the math considerably. A little bit of algebra later, and we have this. We can see the term between rho, which is the surface albedo, and the sky radiance. We can think of that term as an augmented ambient occlusion value that takes account of indirect light. This fixes the main problem with the ambient occlusion approximation at very little added cost. Now, the paper only showed low error for constant albedo scenes, and that doesn't match most game scenes. But in my experience, it works pretty well for varying albedo scenes as well. The same logic applies as to why points tend to see points with the same illumination. Points in a dark valley tend to see other valley points. Points in a high mountain tend to see other mountain points. And those points tend to be similar, not just in lighting, but also in color. And in any case, any extra error introduced is much less than what you get with using regular ambient occlusion. This technique solves the same problem as a much more recent technique, ground truth ambient occlusion, or GTAO, which was introduced in 2016, I believe, by Activision. But to my mind, the Stewart and Langer techniques does so much more simply and with no less accuracy. The Earth and Beyond lighting system itself has been irrelevant for a long time, but I got a technical nugget out of it with long-term value. And I found that buried in the back notes of a paper, referring to a second paper which wasn't even in the computer graphics field, which brings us to my second lesson learned. Useful nuggets of knowledge can appear in the most unexpected places. Keep an eye out and grab them when you find them. The terrain lighting system also led to my first talk at GDC 2001. It was a joint talk with Kenny Mitchell, who had come up with a different terrain lighting technique for another Westwood game. The presentation opened doors. For one thing, it led to other publication opportunities. We spun the talk off into both a Game Developer Magazine article and a book chapter. More importantly, this and other presentations and publications raised my profile in the industry and advanced my career in innumerable ways. But I think I would do this type of educational activity even if it did not lead to any tangible rewards, because I'm just the kind of person who finds this comic almost painfully relatable. I don't get into arguments on internet forums, but over my career, I found various cases where I thought the industry at large was practicing graphics incorrectly, and I felt I had to fix it and teach people the right way to do things. So the terrain lighting system ended up teaching me something else that I followed my entire career. I'm not counting this among the numbered lessons, since I'm sure it is old hat to pretty much everyone in this room. But this was far from universally accepted 1990s game industry. Sharing knowledge is awesome, and you should do it a lot. While the terrain lighting task was assigned to me, my second R&D project was self-initiated. An issue arose when integrating the terrain lighting system into production. The sun and sky lighting color were two independent settings that affected the lighting solution, and the artists weren't sure what their relative brightness should be. And this was a space game with alien planets, so we can just use Earth references. Studying the physical ground truth proved useful for terrain lighting, so I started digging into scattering theory. I realized that the sky color should in principle be derivable via atmospheric scattering, which would enable not only deriving terrain lighting, but procedurally generating sky colors, including effects like sunsets. But as I continued working, I realized that although I understood the basic theory behind atmospheric scattering, I would really need help to find an efficient real-time method. I couldn't do it on my own. Fortunately, at the time, a mutual friend introduced me to Arkut Pritham, who was the perfect collaborator for this project. Arkut had recently done relevant work on analytical sky models, and together we were able to come up with a way to bring physically based atmospheric scattering, with some assumptions and approximations, of course, to 2001 game hardware. I presented this technique at GDC 2002. The presentation turned out to be quite influential, and the technique was used in multiple games by various developers. While working on the atmospheric scattering project, I learned a lot more about optics and started thinking there might really be something to this whole physics-based approach to game graphics, which is another lesson that was very influential to me, but I'm sure it's obvious to the people in this room, so I'm not counting it. In 2002, Earth Beyond finally shipped. Like many other MMORPGs released in this period, it failed to find an audience and was eventually shut down, taking Westwood Studios down with it. The studio was shuttered in 2003, and I found myself looking for my second game development job. Initially, I was looking for another PC development gig because console development tended to be a closed club. You needed experience with the hardware. But new console generations tend to open things up. And indeed, I found a job developing tech for the upcoming PlayStation 3. I was the first person Naughty Dog hired for their ICE team, which was the brainchild of Mark Cerny. Mark had noticed that Sony's internal studios had each spent a lot of effort developing their own internal tech for the PlayStation 2. And he thought having one team developing PlayStation 3 tech for all the internal studios would be more efficient. I've heard that when he deliberated which studio should host this, he chose Naughty Dog because he judged Naughty Dog to have the best PlayStation 2 tech. PlayStation 3 was a good fit for me, since its custom SPU processors actually posed similar instruction scheduling challenges that I had faced writing MMX code. My first experience with PlayStation 3 coding came long before even the first development kits were ready. Basically, the only way to program an SPU was to travel with Mark Cerny to Tokyo to run code on an SPU simulator that was only accessible in a locked room in the Sony Interactive Entertainment headquarters. Another way that the ICE team was a good fit for me was that Mark sometimes needed someone to research some area of graphics. He was anxious to leverage the increased computational capability of the PlayStation 3 to raise the graphics fidelity bar. In particular, Mark felt that improved surface shading models were worth some GPU flops, and he tasked me with investigating them. Personally, I was skeptical. I felt existing real-time shading models were good enough, and that the bigger wins would come from improving lighting models and from spatially varying shading parameters. But if Mark Cerny tells you to do something, you do it. The keep digging into the physics until I had gold approach had served me well in previous projects, so I set out to apply it to surface shading models. Of course, it turned out that I was wrong and Mark was right. This was a richer mine to dig into than in any of my previous ones. I quickly found a wealth of BRDF theory that could be directly used to improve game visuals. This started a multi-decade project that has to some extent defined my career. I'll take a break here from the chronological ordering I've been keeping so far, since this work spans multiple jobs across many years. For a while, every time I started a job at a new company, the first thing I would do would be to help them make the transition to physically based shading. The first step was to convince project leadership that the benefits are worth it. The second step was to work with engineers to help them implement the correct models. But then, another step no less important was working with the game artists, making sure that textures, materials, and lighting were authored with physically motivated values. Having the correct shaders would not provide much benefit if the assets are not authored accordingly. A big part of my work with artists was providing solid references. One low-hanging fruit was computing tables of RGBF0 values for null reflectance at 0 degrees for common materials, starting with their indices of refraction. For the dielectrics, I only needed to find a single IOR value, which was very easy. Metals are more complicated, since their IORs are both spectrally varying and complex valued, but I was able to find online resources for that data as well. However, that wasn't sufficient. I quickly found that guidance needed to be provided on diffuse albedo values as well, which surprised me. I was assuming that's something we just leave up to the artists. I first ran into this when I was at Activision, helping Treyarch transition Call of Duty Black Ops to physically based shading. We encountered an issue with specular highlights being unrealistically bright. And then when I checked, I saw that the F0 values were correct. It turns out that the actual reason was that the diffuse color was set too dark, so the lighting artists were brightening the lighting to compensate. This caused the specular highlights to blow out, even though they were technically correct. And this raised a broader issue. The hue and saturation of diffuse surface color could be freely set by artists based on creative ideas without causing issues, but correct lightness was critical to the balance between diffuse and specular response. We needed some reference. Even a white wall or a black road don't have values that are literally 1 or 0, and we didn't know what those values should be. So I assembled diffuse albedo reference values, just as I had done for specular F0. The track experience showed me that the whole image formation system is tightly coupled. Diffuse colors, specular parameters, and lighting intensity are all intertwined. Looking back, this is why my original skepticism was misplaced. I had thought existing shading models were probably good enough, and that the bigger wins would come from lighting and spatial variation of parameter values. But lighting, model, and parameters are not independent levers. The model determines what the parameters mean, and the parameters determine how lighting is balanced. A bad material value can become a lighting problem, and a lighting workaround can make the shader look wrong. All this was another major lesson for me. There are some rendering techniques that operate behind the scenes and don't involve any artist input or assets, but the vast majority of rendering techniques, you should give asset creation and artist control as much attention as you do to the technical details. Besides helping companies I was working for transition to physically based shading, I also spent time on broader education efforts. The situation hit me right in the someone is wrong on the internet nerve, and I felt duty bound to preach the gospel of physically based shading far and wide. I started giving talks on this topic in 2004, and I haven't stopped yet. My initial efforts were focused on the video game industry, but I soon found an unexpected target for this missionary work. When I started investigating physically based shading, one of the things I looked for was film industry practices. Surely the movie people have this all sorted out, right? But I couldn't find anything. Later, I found out why. The film industry was in the same boat that we were. Adoption of physically based shading models happened in both industries on broadly similar timelines, with the exception of Blue Sky Studios, who were exceptional in many ways. That seems surprising. Film adoption of rendering techniques typically precedes games by many years. Film has vastly more computational resources per frame and higher fidelity expectations. But film didn't need physically based shading models as badly as games did. Film CG has well-defined shots, and time to make each one look good by brute force tweaking, sometimes even painting individual pixels when needed. In contrast, games have to deal with unpredictably changing camera and lighting, and there's no fixing it in post. For film, physically based shading was the difference between making high fidelity images with a lot of effort and making high fidelity images more easily, which is valuable. But for games, these models made high fidelity dynamic images possible at all. Another interesting example is global illumination. One would expect it to have been adopted by film much earlier, but the first film to use it, Casino, only predated the first game, Quake 2, by 2 years. And Quake 2 wasn't an extreme outlier. Beg GI and light maps quickly became a standard way for games to get rich static lighting. I think similar reasons apply as physically based shading. Film could brute force and shot tweak their way to realistic lighting more easily than games can, so the need for a robust automatic solution wasn't as urgent. Anyway, that explains why the film industry was also a ripe target for my physically based shading evangelism. After attending one of my talks in 2010, Bill Paulson asked me to come give a similar talk at Pixar. They had used physically based shading models in the past, but abandoned them with Toy Story 3 for compatibility reasons. They had assets from Toy Story 2 that they wanted to use, and they were now planning to transition back. That was followed by invitations to give similar talks at Disney Animation Studios and DreamWorks Animation. In the case of the Disney talk, I know I was able to be helpful. Brent Burley later told me that it was a direct inspiration for developing the Disney shading model, which in turn was broadly used by many companies across both industries. Overall, the transition to physically based shading models was a success for both industries. It transformed production, giving many benefits. The materials were more robust, the lighting response was more predictable, we had a shared vocabulary to talk about materials, we had better artist references and more stable workflows. But there's a deeper promise fueling the initial excitement behind these models. Certainly in my case, and I strongly suspect for many others. These models were supposed to represent physical reality. They were supposed to provide physically meaningful parameters, an ability to reason about physical behavior, a connection between real world surfaces and render appearance. And eventually, we were expecting to be able to measure the properties of a surface and predict exactly what its appearance would be. There is now evidence that this promise was unfulfilled. More personally, I feel I missed an opportunity. I stopped digging too soon. In 2005, I was looking into wave effects, such as thin film interference, diffraction, etc., and trying to understand if these effects were important in the general case for regular surfaces. I learned some interesting things, but eventually I decided the wave optics are mostly special case and abandoned them to focus on geometric optics. I only realized my error a decade later when I attended the 2015 New Graphics workshop on material appearance and modeling. Nicholas Holschuh and Romain Pakanowski presented work that strongly suggested that for many materials, surface appearance was a combination of geometric and wave optics effects. This reawakened the long felt unease at the back of my mind. The computer graphics community at large had been mostly assuming that wave effects are negligible for common materials, but this assumption had never been properly tested, and here it had been tested and found wanting. I tried to address my earlier mistake by digging again into wave-based BRDFs, which were primarily covered in the optics literature. I came to the conclusion that we really needed a significant validation project to figure out which, if any, of these models were a good match to reality for the wavelength scales and materials that we care about in computer graphics. A given light scattering distribution could be caused by geometric optics effects, wave effects, or any combination of the two. The validation project needs to provide data that allow us to distinguish between these cases. This data should include surface microgeometry measurements, as well as extremely detailed gonio-reflectometric measurements. These would have to cover the full hemisphere, especially glancing angles, where Holchuk and Pakanowski's work indicated that wave effects would be especially strong. The data would have to be polarimetric as well as spectral, since we're trying to determine which model fits with ground truth, not just which one produces a good visible match. Ideally, the project will also include virtual gonio-reflectometric BRDF data that is simulated from measured microgeometry to help in separating various classes of effects. Once we had all this data, we could compare the measured reflectance with the reflectance that the various models would predict, given the surface's measured microgeometry and the simulated BRDF data. If one of the models happens to match, great, we can use it. If none of them match, then things get more interesting. The exact details of the various discrepancies, what wavelengths, what polarizations of light, what angles are the models wrong, those would undoubtedly be helpful in researching a new BRDF model. I only found one existing project that combined gonio-reflectometric and surface microgeometry measurements, but they only looked at very rough metals, and their measurements didn't include glancing angles and weren't spectral or polarimetric. I tried to get my BRDF validation project off the ground. I was talking to different academic institutions, trying to get funding buy-in from my employers. In the end, I wasn't able to make the project happen, and I dropped it. After reading a recent paper, this is a paper I've been promoting on X recently because I think it's very important. I'm more convinced than ever that such a project is needed, primarily to help guide the search for a new BRDF model. The authors of this paper actually were quite clever. They didn't do any gonio-reflectometric measurements. They didn't have the equipment, but they had a clever photo to rendering comparison setup that was able to demonstrate that the current state-of-the-art geometric optics models, as well as wave-based and hybrid alternatives, are all a poor fit to real-world surface behavior when the measured microgeometry is taken into account. Now, rather than a failure, I see this as an opportunity. I feel there's likely to be a model out there that is practical enough for production, gives physically meaningful parameters, better predicts real-world surface behavior, and improves measured material workflows. But there's a lot of work to do to get there. I'm retired now, so I won't be doing it. Instead, I'm issuing a call to action. This can be a very promising research direction for someone who's willing to take it. And this is a lesson I take from my 20-year venture into physically based shading models. When Mark Cerny first approached me, I thought the shading models we used in games back then were good enough. I was wrong. Physically based models are good enough for production, but that doesn't mean surface shading is solved. The original problem with physically based shading was not just looks plausible. It was physically meaningful parameters and predictive behavior. Increasingly, I think the evidence says we are not all the way there. To me, that is not discouraging. It's an exciting opportunity to discover a better model, one that might bring a new set of benefits to production rendering. Good enough is where production starts. It should not be where research stops. Now let's return to the chronological story. When I was on the Naughty Dog Ice team, after working on a bunch of shared technology for Sony's internal studios, I missed the feeling of being on a game team and focusing on shipping a single game. I found an opportunity at one of Naughty Dog's sister studios, Sony Santa Monica, where God of War 3 was starting development. While I was at Sony Santa Monica, I worked a lot with their technical artists. In game development, the technical artist is a key role. The film industry tends to call them technical directors, which means something completely different in the game industry. With a skill set between those of an artistic programmer and especially engineering-oriented artist, the technical artist serves as a bridge between the graphics programmers and the production artists who create game assets. One day, Richard Greenspan, a technical artist I especially liked working with, walked up to my desk with a completely absurd request. He wanted the ability to multiply a reflection map by the diffuse lighting. This will be lighting times lighting, just completely nonsensical from a physics standpoint. My initial instinct was to gently guide Richard back to his desk and bring him a cup of tea, since this seemed like a feverish request. But I realized that Richard must have had a good reason to ask. I'd worked enough with customers of various kinds, artists, designers, technical artists, to appreciate that while they may not know the technical issues as well as I do, they understand the problems they face much better. The issue is that often, instead of describing the problem, they ask for the first solution that pops into their head. That solution is rarely useful, but the problem hiding behind it often is. So I dug into Richard's request and asked him some questions. What problem was he trying to solve? It turns out that Richard's problem was both important and one I was completely unaware of. God of War 3 used reflection cube maps that were generated in the following way. The artist would place reflection capture probes in certain locations throughout the game level. The tools would capture 6 screenshots of the level from each capture location and assemble a reflection cube map, which was used for the part of the level closest to that probe. We couldn't afford many of these reflection cube maps since they used a lot of storage, so each one had to cover a relatively large part of the level. Often a reflection cube map would be used for some geometry where the lighting was quite different from that of the capture location. This could cause jarring mismatches, where the dark corner of a hallway would have bright reflections, making the surfaces look oily, or the reflections in a bright area would be dark, making metals look black. Richard's proposed solution was to multiply the reflection by the diffuse lighting. And that kind of sort of worked. He had already prototyped it as a machine by modifying the shaders, and it produced good results in some cases. But as I mentioned, this solution was not only physically meaningless, that wasn't just a theoretical problem, it would have caused all kinds of havoc if adopted and changed. I knew I needed a different solution. After thinking about it a bit, I realized that Richard's idea was not too far off. A few changes could turn it into a robust and physically meaningful solution. After each reflection map is created, we can divide it by the average value of its pixels. This will produce a unitless reflection distribution map, which denotes for each direction not the reflection color, but the distribution of reflection intensity. One more change from Richard's original idea. In the pixel shader, we don't multiply the reflection distribution map by the total diffuse term, but only the indirect part, which is what best matches the reflections. After that multiplication, we get a reflection map again, but one scaled and tinted to match the local indirect lighting. And there's an important lesson here. Even though I ended up with something much better than Richard's initial proposal, I would have never thought of my solution if he hadn't proposed his. In fact, I wasn't even aware of the problem he was trying to solve. If I just said, that's nonsense, go away, the project would have suffered, and I would have lost a valuable tool. I used reflection distribution maps on multiple game projects over the years. My boss at Sony Santa Monica was Christer Erickson. Christer must have heard from Mark Cerny that I make a good research bloodhound, because he also assigned me a research project. In this case, it was to investigate color grading, so we could add support for it to God of War 3. For those who aren't familiar with color grading, it is the process of deliberately adjusting an image's color, brightness, and contrast to shape how it feels. It can make an image warmer or cooler, softer or harsher, more naturalistic or more stylized, while keeping the underlying content the same. Color grading is universally used in movies, and at the time, games were starting to utilize it as well. I started by looking into the state of the art in game color grading. That turned out to be Valve's system, as used in several of their games, including Left 4 Dead. Valve had a color grading system built into their game level editor, so you could see the effects on the level live as you were changing the settings. It was pretty powerful. It supported a large subset, though by no means nearly the complete set, of color transformations that can be done in Photoshop. One interesting aspect of the Valve color grading system is that rainbow colored patch on the upper left. It represents a 16 by 16 by 16 three-dimensional lookup table. It's just spread out into two dimensions for visualization. This is loaded into a 3D texture that the GPU can access directly. Such a 3D texture is called a color LUT. It represents an arbitrary transformation from input RGB color to output RGB color. To use one, you simply use the RG and B channels of your input color as the X, Y, and Z coordinates of the texture lookup, and then you get the output color immediately. This seemed like a good fit for the God of War 3 implementation. Reading a modestly sized 3D texture was pretty fast on the PlayStation 3. I then did a bit of investigation into film color grading practices. I saw enough to realize that they used a variety of controls that were more powerful than simple hue saturation or curve level adjustments. Using these, movies could achieve color effects that could subtly manipulate the emotional tone of the image or completely transform it. For example, the iconic look of the movie Sin City was created by color grading. These transforms could get quite complex. They might apply selectively to only a particular set of colors. or they may require rather elaborate UI to be effectively controlled, like the 3 separate color wheels plus sliders for lift gamma gain transformation. I really like the flexibility and power of film style color grading, and using 3D LUTs in the implementation meant that the runtime cost would be completely independent of the complexity or number of color transforms. But creating a valve-like system and then adding all those features to it would take a prohibitive amount of work. And every time the artists wanted new control, they would have to ask the engineers for it and wait for us to implement it. The studio culture at Sony Santa Monica included a strong preference for more artist-driven solutions. After trying a bunch of different things, I came up with an out-of-engine color grading workflow. It borrowed one idea from Valve's in-engine color grading system, a 3D LUT spread out in a 2D image. But instead of procedurally deriving the content of the LUT from an in-editor UI, I would provide the artist with an identity LUT. They could paste into a game screenshot and then manipulate the colors of the resulting image in any application of their liking. As long as they stuck to pure color transformations, nothing spatial, anything they did to the screenshot would be faithfully recorded in the LUT strip. When they are done, they just cut out the strip and give it to the level editor tool, which converts it back into a 3D LUT, which would be used during rendering. This is such a small idea. It's a workflow tweak on top of an existing system. I'm almost embarrassed to talk about it, but it was quite effective. And like several of the other techniques we've discussed, I ended up using it many times across multiple companies, and the practice spread pretty widely through the industry. This color grading workflow was such a hit at Activision, I ended up combining it with physically based shading into an introduction package I used whenever I would go talk to a new studio. Most of the studios ended up adopting both physically based shading and the color grading workflow. A few weren't ready to change their shading model yet, but the color grading was always an easy add-on. We see here the color grading setup that Neversoft used for Guitar Hero 5, which utilized the video editing application Sony Vegas. This taught me that sometimes you can take an existing method and make a modest change to it, which produces an entirely new and much more effective workflow. Ideas don't have to be big to have big effects. Although we haven't covered nearly my entire career, the chronological story got up to roughly 2010, and the physically based shading story only extended about 6 years past that. I think I'm out of lessons at this point. When preparing this talk, I went over my last decade of work experiences, and although many of them might yield entertaining anecdotes, I didn't find much in the way of lessons learned that would be useful to this audience. I guess as I became more experienced, my learning moments became smaller and more personal. However, have no fear. Eric and I will now be chatting for a bit, and he'll undoubtedly be able to get some amusing stories out of me relating to the later years. Thank you for listening.